So welcome everybody. Welcome to RevenueTEK's first podcast on data and sales and marketing issues. We've gathered a group of people who I'm going to introduce in a second to share some thoughts and perspectives on some questions that we are encountering repeatedly in the marketplace as companies start to think about how they emerge from COVID. So a lot of confusion, a lot of complexity, and a lot of that coming now from the addition of data into the equation. So hence the subject of today's podcast is really around, what role does data play and what issues does data create in pipeline management, in creation of revenue. So we've gathered an esteemed group of experts, and I'll just quickly introduce the guys who are going to share their thoughts with us in the next 40 minutes or so. So firstly, Derek Udall from AstraZeneca, Head of Data Enablement and Analytics Acceleration. Hi Des, wave to the people. How you doing?
Hey, good to be here.
Yeah, our radio announcer. Simon Hall, who's the MD of Next Gen Marketing Solutions in the UK, digital marketing transformation expert, has held senior roles in marketing with Dell and Microsoft, and has been in and around data and digital for the last 15 or 20 years. So Simon, wave and say hi. Les Hines, who currently the MD of RevenueTEK Europe and has been a sales and marketing leader across global positions really over the last 20 odd years. Say hi, Les.
Hi Craig. Hi guys.
Brad Ison, who's the happiest and most relaxed of our panel because he's on a sabbatical waiting for the birth of his first son in the next couple of weeks. So that's why he's got a smile on his face, and there it is. And Brett's held senior sales roles in analytics and data with IBM and most recently with Synetrics. So hi Brett. So I'm going to just kick us off with a question that's close to my heart and one that I've heard quite a bit in the last little while, and that is around the distinction between data and digital. So the terms are used synonymously; they're almost interchangeably of late, even by people who are in this space. A lot of confusion between the two. So first question for the guys, and I'll start with you, Des. What is the difference, and why does it matter?
So I'll give you the way I like to explain this. We have a lot of discussions around this, and I like to use an example. And the one I use is if you think about catching a taxi, right? So 15 years ago, 10 years ago even, you'd ring up either a dispatch or you'd walk out in the street, put your hand up, flag a taxi down, you'd get into it, you'd probably pay cash or on a card, right? You'd get a little receipt, you come back into the office, you'd fill out a form, you'd walk it round to your manager, put it in one of those big old orange envelopes, manager signs it, they pass it back into the internal mail, ends up at accounts payable, right? You look at catching a taxi today, you look it up on Uber, right? Your credit card's already in there, you order it, it turns up, you get in the car, you get out, there's no cash transaction, right? It's all automatic. You go back to the office, you download your expenses into something like Concur, it automatically expense matches, and the digital process will then just click it through to the accounts payable and received. So digital in that, right? So the first example is an analog experience, right? And the second one's a digital channel. And the way I like to think about it is digital is the actual user experience, right? It's the end-to-end user experience. But data is then what happens within that experience. So spending my career around data for a long time, digital cannot live without data in the pipeline. But data could quite happily sit in the corner as it does, often unused, and data can exist without digital. And, just as a side point, 99.5% of all data generated is never used, right? So data is a hugely complex issue, but digital is the application of that data to achieve an outcome. So I hope that helps. That's the way I like to think about it anyway.
I guess for me, if I'm talking from my perspective and probably a bit more from a marketing perspective, I would see data is a lot of the what. So it's kind of it's all of the aspects that have been created along the go, but digital is more about the how. And the only thing I would say, I wouldn't necessarily agree you can live with data without the digital. Actually, I think these days you can't live without the digital. You need the digital to help you do something with the data. So if you give an example, marketeers today really can't do a good job with data unless they have a mail automation platform, even CRM. I know CRM is used more by sales, but there's obviously a combination of usage across that. So I really think digital technologies are becoming more important to actually deal with the data, to clean it up, to get to some crunching of the data, etc.
Looking at it from a very sales lens perspective, I'd say salespeople, sales managers today can't really survive without either. And digital is something that they work with every day, and data drives it. In sales, it's a numbers game more often than not, and you need the data to give you the analytics, gives you the insights to work on a daily basis.
So, we've all heard of this explosion of data, and Des just mentioned 99.5%, of all the data that, gets created, no one can do anything with. And, we've spoken to organisations here, just recently who complain about drowning in it, and they've got so much data and they don't know what to do with it. So, what are your views on that? Because if it's exploding now, it's unlikely that genie goes back in a bottle.
There's no chance.
If it's running,
right.
it's almost like the expansion of the universe, right? Everything's red shifting away. So how do you think about, how do you deal with that from a?
So I'll kick in here, right? I think there's more data generated in the last 2 years than the rest of human history, right? And that will go 10x in the next 12 to 18 months, right? And it's not just standard data, right? It's not the fact that it's tabular data. It's the fact that, you're going to get natural language processing of call centers, right? I'm working with a guy who's trying to analyze 1 million x-rays in Brazil, right? And look at visual optics. Amazon released last week its new Fitbit that's picking up on your voice and is going to start measuring your mood. So you've got this incredible explosion of data, and the challenge is you can't get on top of it, right? It's going to continue to be prolific, and it's going to continue to decentralize, right? And anybody can go out and put a BI tool on a pile of data and start cranking stuff out. So you get into AI ethics and all sorts of interesting things that will be really big in the next 10 years. I would just say, I think, the challenge is it's not going to go away. You're not going to sit there. It's like saying 20 years ago, don't worry, this internet thing won't happen, right? And it's a matter of how you get your head around how you're going to tackle it, right?
I think an interesting part of this, and just going back to when I started in computing, we had to deal with storage, which was in kilobytes. Now we've got terabytes, and when we were very, very constrained by storage, we had to think very, very carefully about what data we were going to capture and what data we were going to store. So we probably used a lot more of the data that we had because we had so little. Where we're now not using 99.5% of all the data that's there. I think, for me, the challenge comes is how do you mine that data for the meaningful insights? I always go back to data becomes information, becomes insights, becomes intelligence, becomes action. What's the process, if you will, behind that? Because, yes, there are BI tools and there's AI and all this stuff around data. But, sometimes you've got to go back to the simple stuff is, what are we storing? How do we use it? What's the intelligence, the insight we're going to get? Because there probably is an awful lot of value there, which people just don't have the time to sit back and think about.
From a sales perspective, I mean, it's about applying it to the basics around sales and how you survive. So really, and thrive. So it's about creating quality opportunities, progressing those opportunities, and then on a daily basis, how do you use data to drive those activities? So being able to react in real time to what's happening in your customer base, with assistance from the available analytics and tools that are out there today. That would really bring a lot of value to me as a salesperson or as a sales manager, as opposed to being forced by, say, the management to put my opportunities in a CRM that's just going to be used to up the chain. It's really about me out there at the coal face. How can that help me? How can that help me on a daily basis? And I think that's where the opportunity is for using data and bringing it to insights and bringing it to action. So yeah, I think that's you're purely looking at it from a sales perspective on that basis.
It sounds like what you're saying is it's, and I mean, I guess there's no surprise in this. It's ultimately about trying to extract some value out of it, right? How to turn raw material into something that's much more valuable than its existing state. So I went to a conference. That's 2014 now. Actually, you were there, Brett. Then at the Mandalay Bay in Vegas back in the good old days, right? And I'll never forget this. I don't know who he was, but he had a big Texan accent, and he stood up on the stage, and there were, I don't know, probably 5,000 or 6,000 people there, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, data is the new oil." No, the new oil, and there was all this this excitement and buzz around that this thing was going to create all this value. But thus far, it's not really, is it? It's we're trying to grapple with it, trying to wrestle it to the ground. Are we actually making any progress on that?
Yeah, no. So I'm just if I think about almost everything that's going on at the moment. So I do a few things with regards to not just marketing but also innovation. And Les knows this because he was doing a guest speech for me last week on data-driven innovation. But we're seeing it's almost like the lion's share of innovation now is data-driven. Okay, and it's using data in different ways. But I also think it's quite interesting when we look at the whole machine learning AI thing. So if you look at the reports from McKinsey, they're saying that it's grown from nowhere in 10 years to 10% of GDP. But also data apparently is contributing 3% to cross-border trade. It's apparently data is becoming more and more important in the whole cross-border trade and facilitating business. So I actually think data, I mean, as a marketeer as well, just talking about the marketing discipline then, you can't really do anything well without data anymore. The first thing people say to me, what's my starting point with data? I said, I understand the customer. And then how do you understand the customer? I said, well, you analyze the data, you look at the insights. Yeah, you can sit down and have a discussion with them. You can only do it with so many customers. At an aggregate level, you'll need to go in and dive into the insights. Where do you start? Google Analytics. So you do data analytics. So I think data is the oil. It's going to be the oil more and more. And if I look at a recent report from Dun & Bradstreet on data-driven marketing, they're basically saying 90% of marketers today see data as important and data quality is important, but 50% have no confidence in the data. They think there's some quality issues in the data. So it's going to become more important how we deal with that. So it may not be the oil that we were thinking about from the past, but I think it's going to become the oil.
All right. Well, I know, Des, you've got views on data reliability and governance and structures, right? We've spoken about this before. Yeah.
No, I think it's absolutely the new oil, right? I mean, you look at the Facebooks, you look at Microsoft. Microsoft's $200 a share. You know, it was $20 a share when Satcher came in, right? I mean, it's neck and neck with these big cloud providers. And I think, you know, to Les's point, we used to have to think about compute, we had to think about storage. That stuff's unlimited now, right? So the question is not a matter of physical constraint to use data, it's the ability to actually work out what to do with it. And we've been grappling this question, I think, for the last 5 to 10 years, and the tooling that is now available and really coming out to be big, and the things we're playing with is insanely good, right? And so you're really going to unlock the haves and the have-nots who can get it, right? And Carney produces a thing called the Analytics Index once a year, and they've calculated the difference between laggards and leaders who can get their head around their analytics is a 60% P&L uplift. It's that stark, right? So I think, you know, data quality is a big issue in this, but I speak to some of my vendors that I deal with, and they deal with such phenomenal volumes of data, right, at such insane levels. They're like, I guarantee the biggest challenge you're going to have is taking even what I can give you with poor data and transforming your organization. It's not the data. We just work at such insane volumes, you know, that we can pick needles out of haystacks the big as Earth, right? So that's the fascinating bit, is that data can churn through a degree. Now, the thing I'd challenge is, you go, right, so data is important. How on earth do I go after this, right? So McKinsey comes out and says 26% of all major transformations fail, right? Sorry, 26% pass, 75% fail.
That's right, 75%
Got that wrong.
Yeah.
Right? So you go, okay, so the big transformations don't work. Unbelievably hard to get it done. The landscape for tooling is easily, I think, last count we tried was 30,000 plus tools, right? It's breaking into subsystems and microsystems and all sorts of bits and pieces. The only way you can do this is you have to be somewhat compartmentalized, right? And in the senior execs I work with, they're sitting above this kind of firestorm going, how on earth do I just run my business end to end? Where do I start, right? And you've got to be able to look from soup to nuts, right? It's the length of the Nile, right? You look at the whole thing, from the guy out there having the first conversation all the way through to someone booking a sale in the P&L, right? You've got to be able to find little bits, and you test and learn all the way through, right? You can't bring in the chopper loads of senior consultants and their 3,000 page PowerPoint decks anymore, because it's moving too fast and you don't get the results, right? So, you know, I think that the new oil is absolutely there. The challenge is you can't use existing methods to tackle it, right? And the execs have got to own it, right? They can't expect some external third party to come out and give them the answer, right?
Yeah, I think that's really good. I think about Formula One. You know, I was watching the Grand Prix last weekend, and you think about, you know, Formula One in its heyday, quotes, where there was a pit board that somebody hung off the side of the you know, start-finish straight, and then you go back to Formula One today, and I think, you know, we're talking about immediacy and timeliness and all of those things.
Yeah, right.
You've got a car going around a track, it's feeding back its speed, the temperature, the tires, the driver's saying what it feels like. They've got downforce. You know, they've got all
DRS,
this, you know, drag reduction system, when to use it. They've got battery management. When can I get the extra piece of push? And you know, the driver's giving feedback as they're saying, you know, go to P5, go to B4. But when you look at what goes on, you've got a guy in a car going around a track, but you've got the guys on the pit wall, you've got the guys in the pit lane, you've got the guys in the caravan that's at the back of the pit lane, you've got all those people at headquarters. You've got this huge, you know, sophisticated team. But what they seem to have done is they understand the immediacy. So, you know, you're trying to overtake someone, back off because your engine's getting a bit warm. You know, you're going to have to run off the racing line because you need to get out of someone's. It always fascinates me that, you know, Formula One, those cars are getting more and more reliable. And, you know, they somehow have, you know, they've got through this thing of, I've got all of this data, what's it telling me? How do I use it? How do I use it real time? But, you know, Toto Wolff, the head of Mercedes, sits there, and to his credit, he says, look, you know, it's not me. Lewis says, it's not me. We've got this huge army of people, this huge technology, and the ability to make, as you say, Des, finite changes, small incremental finite changes on the go. because you've got 62 laps of this stuff, and you've got to get over the finishing line.
The one thing I'll quickly add to that, just as a counter, or not a counter, but to add to it, is the integration of that, because you just mentioned all these different people, right? And you think of how much money Formula One throws in to get that thing to be so unbelievably quick. If you're a senior executive with a sales pipeline or an inventory management process or the rest of it, you would dream to have that pop on your desk. Very, very hard to see. I don't think I've ever seen it, right? And you've got to have some process where you're going to sit there and, something falls through the gaps and something pops up, right? You know what I mean? And it's not, I don't think that the systematization of that, unless you've got a bottomless pit of money to be able to pay for it, is feasible, right? I mean, it can in Formula One, but in reality, Formula One's nirvana, right? It's a great example.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's nirvana for sure.
Yeah. But I think that there are certain things we can learn from that. And you say if you're the exec sitting over this, I mean, Simon and I were talking about this last week. Many businesses are still set up in silos. You've got the marketing silo, the sales silo, you've got the operations silo, you've got the finance silo. They're set up as silos. They operate as silos. Their data is sometimes stored in silos. It's stored in different formats. They have different labels on the same data. There are some of the basics, I think, that this joined up end-to-end concept, I think, is one of the main challenges for any organization. Is how do I take this end-to-end view? As we know from surveys that we run, if a pipeline is converting 1.92% of first inquiries to orders, that's a process that's failing in excess of 98% of the time. There's got to be huge opportunity in there. It's again, how do you see the wood for the trees in this stuff? Where do you start? And I think to your point, Des, the end-to-end view is possibly where you do start and actually sort of bang people's heads together to get them to say, let's join this all up. Let's actually accept it's a single process and then see where we go with this.
Isn't it?
I think that's being done. I think that not necessarily in revenue management or, unpacking the sales process end to end, but if you look at finance and what people are doing, say with like accounts payable or accounts receivable, and starting to look in that process end to end, applying different analytics platforms. It's possible. It's possible, but I don't think it's been applied to the sales and marketing process and looking at it end to end, and then trying to look at driving time and cost out of that process and driving efficiency. That's where the opportunity is. I really think that's where the opportunity is for organizations, and they're very focused on that AR AP stuff, but why aren't they not focused on the revenue side? So it's a question probably Craig's been asking for a long time, but I think that the tools are out there now, that it's possible, and then it's just a matter of having the executive focus, and as you say, it's a team sport. Everybody's got to play their role.
I think to Les's Formula One metaphor, the thing that focuses, it's a big complicated machine with with multiple stages. Like a lot of things have got to happen in order and in sequence for the result to happen, but they have a commonality of purpose. They want to win a race. They want to win. They want to win a championship. And if everyone starts with a common purpose, you can backtrack, right? And all of the processes and the people and the data and everything comes together with a view to how do we all get to that point, right? What's thus far lacking, I think, if we bring it back to the marketing and sales and the revenue world, is that commonality of purpose. I'm not sure everyone's there yet.
No, and I think, so what you've got, and it comes back to your data is all question, is you've got so many data points now that you can look at, if you can find them, right, that can improve a performance, right? I've done a webinar through a client I've worked with, right? And COVID related, big deal. We've never really done webinars. We've gone out and met everybody previously face to face. And all of a sudden we have to start running, virtual events and have people turn up. We asked the web stream company and they thought that 23,000 people turned up. It was a record. We put a couple of tags on the site, found that 43,000 people turned up, and 20,000 people never made it through the registration process because we made it unbelievably hard. And, you know, people turn up on, and we designed the thing that you turn up on a PC, right? And we got it all wrong. We got it all completely wrong. And we found that out in 48 hours, and we lost 50% of the people who turned up to the webinar, right? So the ability to look at a process and something that you think a bit, you know, the analogy to go and look at little segments and do things, and then look at their next best behavior. What you can track down to a click. So we could find out exactly where someone fell out and where they hated the registration process and which button we would change, right?
Yeah.
All of this is there.
Yeah.
So when we came to the next webinar, we had a 20% uplift, right? And just having, we weren't selling anything. It was just people turning up to listen that would lead into sales pipeline, right?
Yeah.
But these micro data points are there. It's how you know, and I could have brought a consulting house in and spent $1 million on that, and 3 months I wouldn't have got any faster. So we had to own it ourselves, and we had to think about the process we were trying to do and which bit we pulled out, dissected, and put back in and tweaked, and it worked really, really well. You know what I mean? But that's the bit, right? This is this new oil thing where, you know, you can mine the phone conversation, you can mine people online, you can mine all sorts of things. And not only have you got the data sitting there, but you've got privacy regs, right? Where you've got now 38 different jurisdictions around the world putting very different privacy regs on it, which basically are saying, I, the consumer, have the right to play with my data. What are you doing? And that makes it really, really tricky to go and mine this stuff and have a valuable sales event or a value engagement with a customer when these landmines are being placed in terms of what you can actually find out and what you can't.
So, I mean, I'm just listening into you there, Derek. It's an interesting point, but when we talk about this end-to-end sort of mapping, and, you know, I remember when I was probably earlier in my career, my manager basically said, I need you to do an end-to-end map. And I was in sales and marketing, the sales and marketing unit, and he said, you're going to have to go to the factory, you're going to have to do this, and I'm like, whoa, this just feels really, how do I do this, you know?
Right.
And I actually think this is a skill, because a lot of, and it requires two things. I think it requires what we call boundary spanning skills. It requires people in their function to go well out of their function and across multiple functions. But it also requires kind of a trust coming down from executives to say, this is the way we're going to do it. We're going to put our faith in the data and this process to actually understand where it's going. And I think that's, you know, even going to a company like Dow, where, you know, we had CRM system only. And then in 2015, so 5 years ago, 2015, 2014, there were only 3 regions that were trying out marketing automation. But there was no integration between marketing automation and CRM. You know, there's very little, there was some in those 3 regions, but obviously you think at a global level, there are so many countries not using it. So I think there wasn't enough. I think there needs to be a faith from an executive level down to say, this is what's going on. There needs to be a kind of thinking about these skills that go well beyond specific roles to actually encompass other roles to actually be able to do that well. So it's interesting to hear what you just said there, Derek, that a, you know, organization like yourself with probably very skilled people still got it wrong, because it sounds like it's new territory, trying to do something online or do something, you know, different.
That was it. Yeah.
But they learn from it, which is good with the data. So that's another good thing you've got there. But I think a lot of organizations don't have that faith and that skill spanning type, you know.
Well, I think that's some of the deer in the headlight that happens with this, right? I don't think execs often know where to start. You look at it and go, I mean, there's still, I think, denial about, is it changing? I mean, you're going to come to work and think it is changing, and then it come in tomorrow and it's like, what's changed again, right? I mean, that's what's going on, right? It's at that pace of, I've got to come in and realize that something's changed since yesterday, and whether I like it or not, you know, the way my company exists and what it does is got to shift from something that it was doing yesterday or last week, right? It's that dynamic. And then the question is, you go, oh my God, what am I going to do to fix it, right? Where do I start, right? And that's that executive roadmap that I think you need some perspective that says, I keep looking at something that pings at me and says, something's now flashing red that wasn't flashing red yesterday. That would give me a lot more comfort, because the world will keep going, right? It's going to keep changing. It's like, where do I go in and get into the plumbing and have a play? that is going to unblock something that's caused me an issue, right? And at least then I'd sleep a bit better. You know what I mean?
I mean, is it fair to say that at an executive level, with everything that they've got going on, at the end of the day, all they need is red, amber, green. So, if stuff's green, I don't want to think about it. If stuff's red, I do want to think about it. It's how you present the information to them sometimes, because they're frightened of detail in some cases. I sat in boardroom meetings for years, and very often, people didn't want the blindingly obvious to be stated because there was a fear about it being stated. And yet, when you look at the complexity of all of this, I mean, I like Simon's thing here about skill sets. That what skill set does an executive need today? Because I did a visiting lecture for one of the business schools locally here, and found that they were teaching out of 15-year-old prescribed textbooks. And if you think of where we were 15 years ago with data and analytics and storage and whatever else, if we're churning graduates out of business schools who are learning how it was done 15 years ago, what skill set should they have? And is a key skill set for an executive now a real awareness of this whole concept of process, end-to-end, insights, timeliness, take action, get the feedback. What does an executive need to make sense of this world of data and digital?
Well, they have to test and track. They have to be analytical. They need a framework that they can work with their team to transform, as Derek says, on a daily basis. They've got to be able to be agile in that way. Otherwise, they're not going to survive. And they have to be data driven at the end of the day in their decisions. So, yeah.
I mean, Simon, you're active on the teaching arena at this point. I mean, what are you seeing out there?
Well, I mean, so the thing that I teach, I wrote the content for that. So they basically approached me 2-3 years ago, and then they said, "We'd like you to teach this, but can you update all the information?" And I said, "Sure, I'll do that." So I had to do a whole. So that you're right, the stuff was quite old. I had to just redo the whole lot myself. So everything that I'm teaching, I've leveraged. But the funny thing is, I did that 3 years ago, and then this year I had to overhaul it again, and that's on a skill set level. I think the one thing that I'm seeing is we have all these great tools, and it might be related to a question you may be thinking about, Craig. There, I know. But we have all these great tools, and with the best will in the world, there are still problems with integration. So I'll give you an example. So I talk to executives in companies quite regularly through my courses and workshops. And so there's this thing of obviously marketing automation, and you have CRM. And there's one company, and I'll mention HubSpot, pride themselves on they can integrate their marketing automation, but they also have a CRM system, but they pride themselves on they can integrate with so many CRM platforms. And it's actually true. And everyone I talk to in companies who are using HubSpot as a marketing automation say, "Great, I can integrate it. I got no problems," and they have issues. So I talk to companies who use Salesforce. So this is actually people who are using Salesforce and decided to buy Salesforce's, so their CRM system, and buy Salesforce's own marketing automation platform called Pardot. And I heard a year or so ago some people saying, "Well, we can't integrate them." And I said, hang on, guys. You've got the same company that produces an application for CRM and an application for marketing automation, and you're saying you can't integrate. So I thought, okay, maybe it's fixed in the meantime. I was chatting to a few companies last week, and I said, well, there was this thing that was going on. Is this still happening? And two of them stood up and said, well, we got that problem. We can't integrate them. I said, what do you mean? We have tried integrating these platforms. We can't integrate them. And I was like, so if you have a company, and these are some big company, I won't mention their name, but they cannot integrate marketing automation and CRM. Yeah. So how can you do the job effectively of this end-to-end customer journey if you just physically and literally, technically can't integrate?
Well, there's an extra element to that, Simon, and that's, and the marketing automation is obviously the top end of the pipe, the marketing piece, and roughly speaking, CRM looks after the bottom half of the pipe. And then there's the history, which is in the general ledger. So, not that long ago, we were talking to a company here in Australia. Same story. They were ceiling to floor and wall to wall a particular vendor. And that vendor had a marketing automation offering, a CRM, and a ERP / general ledger. They could not integrate the whole lot to give a view down that pipeline across that business. And this is a big, sophisticated organisation. So, and that's that's 3 months ago. So, this.
So Craig, I'll give you an example. Right? So I've worked in organisations with 350,000 people in it, right? And the larger it is, the worse it gets. It's not easier, right? Because everybody is out there buying tools. But I'll give you a simple example, right? I'll put the data hat on, right? You've got to ingest your data, curate, wrangle your data, API your data, do all that advanced analytics I was talking about with NLP if you want to go down digital twinning and some really, really sophisticated stuff. You've got to get your data governance in place. You want to make sure you got good quality. You want to make sure you hang on to your data the right amount of time. You're a data architect. You catalog your data, find out what's in it. You've got to have privacy and security over the whole thing, right? And you still got, at the end of the day, present something to the end user, right? MIT came out and said 90% of a data scientist's time is hauling and putting data together. And of the remaining 10%, 90% of that is trying to aggregate it and get it what we call metadata aggregation to come together, right? So 99% of a data scientist's time is actually a data engineer. Now, in 5 years' time, this might be a different case, but data scientists are actually hidden data engineers in wolf's clothing or sheep's clothing, right? Out of the 30,000 tools, right, that we assessed and went and had a look at, one tool could probably do 3/4 of what I just talked about, right? And that starts at $500,000 for a POC, $500,000 US, right? So
we should start
unless you're a Formula One driver, right? That is the landscape that you're dealing with. And remember, 26% of transformations done don't pass. I wonder why, right? So even, Simon, to your point, and that level of marketing automation, that's just 2 dimensions in those 15 things I just threw out, right? It's not the rest of it. And that's what keeps us up, right? So you've really got to a tool will not solve it. The data will keep generating. You need some sort of executive headspace that says, I've got to try and chunk this down. And as it changes, I've got to be able to be nimble and reflective and go and find where things, I do think red, amber, and green is enough, and find out where it flashes red, right? And start there, because that is better than what you got today. Because at the moment, everything's just grey, right?
I mean, I know when I was flying around the world, I dreamed of red, amber, green, because when you're jumping off a plane in Sydney at 5 o'clock in the morning, and someone in Chicago is trying to get your attention, and they want to send all this stuff to you, it's just like, the stuff that's okay, I don't need to know about. The stuff that's red, that you need my attention on, let's focus on it, because jet lag and time zones and all the rest of the stuff just doesn't work. I mean, at one point I had a full-time system analyst trying to pull the basic information out of ERP, CRM, marketing automation stuff, just to try and give me some level of insight. Huge overhead. But I just wanted that stuff. Tell me where I am versus where I need to be. I want to know what the gap is, because the gap's going to tell me what I need to focus on. It sounds simple, but it was just, again.
And that's Simon's integration point. Integration is the hardest bit. Finding the data is not too bad. Data quality, you can actually generally do okay with, although some of it can be horrific. It's integrating is where the time goes, right? And everybody's trying to build pyramids of data to get the soundbite. You don't have time to build great offerings of data. You've got to come and meet it halfway down the stack, I think, right? You've got to try and get in and find out where you look.
So I think it's interesting you mentioned the data quality piece there, Derek, because I'll probably tell 2 quick things. The first thing is I was looking at this whole thing of data decay, and apparently, on average, phone records, any records that people have about their customers are decaying between, I think it's 15 to 20%, depending on what you look at in a sort of 12 to 18 month period. So this is stuff from So I remember a time when at Dell we were looking at our penetration into the market in a particular area. So 10,000, we were looking at a sort of universe of 10,000 accounts, and we'd get into really quite fierce arguments, discussions about our performance versus target, why we weren't sort of growing as we would have, and all the rest of it. And we kept sort of like, well, the data's fine. We're fairly confident that the data. And then we said, listen, you know what? We better just do a data check. So we went to an external company, and they looked at these 10,000 records of so-called companies, and we found 10% were consumers, so they were not even companies. 10 to 15% had gone out of business. 10% were channel resellers. We were looking at actual companies. And there was another 5%, I can't remember what it was. So we had a 40% data integrity issue, which was driving massive friction in the system. And these sort of what I would call almost wasted discussions. I mean, not wasted in the sense it led us to say, let's do something about it, but wasted in terms of, had we known we had a 40% data integrity issue, we were like, okay, guys, we've got a 40% data integrity issue. We're actually doing, almost twice as much as we thought we were doing. We're performing twice as much better because we got almost not quite a 40% data integrity issue, but 40%. So still, those conversations were not really realistic. But it was interesting that it made me think afterwards. It's not about just the integration, but it's having good quality data and then making sure we constantly keep the quality up. I think that's a challenge because I'm a marketeer, and I always think I get into all these other lovely conversations, even in B2B, which are fairly commercialized. But now I'm getting more and more people in companies, in large enterprise companies, ask me, how do you deal with data quality? I'm like, surely this is not a question for a marketeer, but actually it is becoming more of a like, how do I clean the data? And it's like, okay, I need to go and fathom that out. So it's kind of interesting that in that discipline you get that. We're also probably seeing more in sales and ops now.
Yeah.
One of the big things I'll just add to that is, and it's a long old-fashioned data term, and it's a really important part of that end-to-end pipeline, is lineage, right? Like if you don't know where your data comes from and you don't actually can track it back to a golden source, then it's going to be dubious. And I've seen tens of millions of dollars wasted on projects because someone thought that the data that sat here was good because I've been using it for a long time, right? And we turned around to this particular project and 85% of the data was rubbish, right? And one of those large organizations, I won't name them, with hundreds of thousands of heads, has 0 identified golden sources. They can't even find the mouth of the river for any of it, right?
Yeah.
So the challenge is when you find this, go back to our red, amber, greens, and you can find it, right?
Yeah.
The first thing to go back and do, the first question to ask yourself is it real? Right?
Yeah.
Is this really what's going on?
Yeah.
But you spend time on it and you'll find out and you go, oh, no, it's not. It's got consumers in it when I'm looking for B2B, right?
Yeah.
But you start to clean it and, you're dead without it. It's like silting your pipes. So data governance and data quality is just going to be one of the it's the next cyber for the next 10 years, right?
Yeah.
No one believes cyber until everyone got hacked. DQ's next.
Yeah.
You heard it here first. That's my call.
Yeah. Des, I have an interesting question, and you may or may not want to address this, but you're talking about common purpose and that driving change or whatever. Clearly, COVID, nobody saw it coming. It hit everybody earlier this year, and obviously there was a scramble for things like for research for vaccines and whatever else. I mean, as a common purpose external driver, what change has that facilitated or forced inside organizations?
Well, the vaccine's an interesting one given my day job, right? So
so that's why I say you may. I'm talking in general. I mean, has it forced people to change behavior? Has it forced people to be pragmatic? Has it forced people to be more processor? I mean,
I think both.
changes?
I mean, definitely that we've had brutal prioritization around where we spend time and money, right from the board down. And then also, I think we have seen behavior change as well. So I think and I think people are now, if we go back and talk about digital, it's not just whether they might do it, they have to do it now. They have to do it. Everybody has to do it. So I think the feedback I've had from, the executives that I deal with is we've had to prioritize. We've had to decide where we spend our time and money, and those areas are quite different to what it was pre-COVID. So they've had to sort of pivot a little bit and focus on the areas that give them not a short to medium return as opposed to a long term, And then an example of that is like, okay, we're just in EMEA and the Americas today. We probably won't go to AP. We'll focus on our key customers and we'll really try and double down on them and extract more and treat them better or whatever. But, that's probably, some feedback in terms of how has COVID affected, organizations.
I think it's forced change. I think there's a degree of people. I'll give you a simple example, right? Like Bunnings. Bunnings has had a pretty average online offering until they shut all the stores, and the only way you could order anything was through the website and go down and pick it up in the back of your car. Guess how fast they got their act together? And it was the nice little service coming Victoria in 31 weeks of lockdown, right? They pivoted their whole business very quickly. So now they've kind of lit up and gone, hang on a sec, we're going to spend a ton of money on this and it's going to take off. So I think that Brett's point, right? It's freed up a lot of thinking because people have had to change to survive. But to go back to the first part of this conversation, there's still no magic way to solve it, right? I think there's more people who've added the boat of now going, well, what do I do, right? Who do I bring up? Where's that transformation number? Does it get better than, 26% success? No. Oh, all right. So it's the same concept. So I think it's jolted people into action, but it doesn't make the solution any easier, right? It's still the same problems, just more people are facing it, right?
I also think there's been a shift in kind of the pools of data, if you want to call it that. So if you think of this sort of buyer journey, the going from awareness all the way through to purchase, etc. We kind of looked at stats 5 years, 6 years ago from Series Decisions, and Forrester that said that a customer would go through 50% of their journey before they buy something, before they interact with the company. So before there's any direct interaction, that's moved to 80% on average in the last year. So the same companies have done that. So what does that mean for organizations, not just marketing, is where the data was sitting has shifted. So it's kind of shifted more there's a lot more shifted into a marketing area where they need to be able to understand what's going on with the customer before they're having that back and forth interaction with sales. So I think there's a shift, but I also think on top of that, there's this whole volume increase. So we're needing more data to understand what's going on in that area before they get into that interaction and back and forth with the sales guy. Because, I think there's the factor is that those cycles are getting longer and longer. So I'm happy to share with you some reports on that in terms of we've seen a lengthening by, I think it's like 25-30% of those. So we need more and more data, and it's not always structured data. So this thing of structured and unstructured. So the idea is marketeers now need to have to deal with more data. They now need to think about how they deal with that data and which data they should be looking at.
We see a huge shift into unstructured, right? And it makes it incredibly challenging and also real time, not batch, which is a complexity factor, right? And the other thing you're finding, and this is not proprietary, you read it in the market, right, is that consumers are becoming more open to sharing their data, right? They've got apps on their phone. You get smart inhalers for asthmatics, smart blood pressure meters. You get some very interesting end-to-end technologies, and you're starting to see ecosystems, and this is nothing proprietary for AstraZeneca, you just see it in the market, where hospitals, particularly in emerging markets, are starting to team up with patients who are willing to share their data to get an uplift in terms of the healthcare experience, right? With companies like AstraZeneca and other major pharma and biopharma. So when you put that in a marketing lens, the frontier of what you used to be able to do, which is what day do I send Jimmy an email or maybe a text message, you're now getting the situation where call center apps exist where they can try and predict your behavior before they ring you and see whether you're in a good mood to take a call, right? We're getting into behavioral analytics, right?
Yeah.
So, and it's all just inferred, right? It's in your phone, it's picking up out of your speech. These are all data dynamics. They're all unstructured, right? And they're all
It's interesting you mentioned
differentiators.
that. I was teaching some Brazilian students last year, and there was a student that was in the class, and she had a patch on her, like a little thing on her arm, and it somehow came up and just said, "This is my sensor that detects my glucose level, and it's linked to my smartphone, and it tells me exactly how I should moderate that depending on what's going on the day." And I was like, "Wow, that's impressive." And I was quite impressed that there seems to be, from these Brazilian students, one was actually working in the area of agriculture. They were all working in different companies, and they were talking about using data analytics to analyze what's going on with crop yields and things like that, and had drone technology linked to a back-end infrastructure managing that. I was impressed, I have to say, and surprised about how much further the technology and data were being used in so many fields that I had never considered.
Yeah. There's an interesting thing that just prompted by what you were saying there about the buyer's journey and 80% and whatever else, and just sort of made me think about, are processes driven by the data, or is the data driven by the process? If you think about the way the process is run in silos, there was a marketing process and they had their data, and there was a selling process and they had their data, and there was a ledger process and they had their data. With COVID, what happens when the processes were driven by the seller? And one thing maybe with COVID is that the process now is driven by the buyer, and therefore the alignment of data with processes changes dramatically overnight, because now you've got to track the buyer journey, and they decide when they want to talk to the website, they decide when they want to talk to marketing, or engage, they decide when they want to engage with selling. So is there a process versus data, one leading the other, challenge that needs to be considered as well?
I think absolutely. And the magic from an executive is, when is my point of engagement? When's my Goldilocks scenario to not annoy them, but to trigger that event, right? When have I got their attention, when I can come in and hit them when their mind is open to exactly what I'm trying to do, at least from a sales perspective, right? Or from a health perspective, are people taking their meds or other things? But it's getting very interesting that there's a certain degree, and we learned that through those webinars, where we thought we had 20,000 people turn up, but we didn't. We missed half of them, right? And we could look at that by country, right? I could see who was turning up. Different countries had different behaviors. They used different devices. We could build a very interesting persona that suited different people in different markets. And we're just scratching the surface, right? And anything like that, it makes it less of a coin toss to achieve an outcome. You're actually starting to really just move that bell curve a little bit in your own favor, and lots of little decisions will add up to make really impactful decisions if you do them at the right part of the process, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And there is no magic. You've got to discover it yourself, right?